In 1942, a young British officer named Ord Wingate presented a military strategy so radical, so seemingly suicidal, that senior commanders wanted him court-martialed just for suggesting it. He proposed taking thousands of soldiers deep behind Japanese lines in the Burmese jungle, cutting them off from all supply lines, all reinforcements, all hope of conventional rescue, and having them survive entirely by airdrops and sheer audacity while they destroyed Japanese communications, railways, and supply routes, and supply depots. And what made this plan even more insane was that Wingate himself was considered half-mad by his own superiors. A biblical scholar who quoted scripture in battle planning sessions, who wore an alarm clock around his wrist instead of a watch, who brushed his body hair with a toothbrush instead of bathing, and who had attempted suicide just months before by stabbing himself in the neck. Yet somehow this eccentric, possibly unhinged officer convinced Winston Churchill himself to approve an operation that violated every principle of conventional warfare, an operation that would become known as the Chindits, named after the mythical Burmese lions that guarded temples. And these weren't elite special forces, they were ordinary British and Indian soldiers, many of them clerks and cooks and administrative personnel who had never seen combat, suddenly being asked to march hundreds of miles through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, infested with malaria, dysentery, tigers, and Japanese patrols, with no guaranteed way home, because Wingate's philosophy was simple and terrifying. Conventional military wisdom said you needed secure supply lines, you needed reinforcements, you needed a line of retreat. But Wingate believed all of that made you weak, made you predictable, made you vulnerable. So instead, he would make his men completely self-reliant, living off the jungle when possible, supplied by air when necessary, moving fast and striking hard before melting back into the wilderness. And the first Chindit expedition launched in February 1943, with 3,000 men divided into 7 columns crossing the Chindwin River into Japanese-occupied Burma. And for the next 4 months, they operated in complete isolation behind enemy lines, blowing up bridges, derailing trains, cutting telegraph wires, creating chaos throughout the Japanese rear areas. But the cost was staggering, because Wingate had miscalculated the jungle's brutality. Men began dropping from exhaustion. Malaria ravaged the columns. Dysentery left soldiers too weak to march, and the Japanese, once they realized what was happening, began hunting the Chindits relentlessly. So Wingate made the controversial decision to order his men to disperse into smaller groups and try to escape back to India on their own, every man for himself. And what followed was a nightmare of survival. Men stumbling through the jungle, delirious with fever, some dying of starvation, others drowning trying to cross the swollen Chindwin River. Of the 3,000 men who went in, only 2,000 made it back, and most of those were physical wrecks, emaciated, diseased, many never fit for combat again. And by conventional military standards, the operation was a disaster. They had suffered 30% casualties for minimal strategic gain. Any rational analysis would conclude the Chindits were a wasteful failure, except for one problem. The Japanese were terrified, because for the first time since the war began, British forces had proven they could operate in the jungle, could outfight Japanese soldiers on their own terrain, could penetrate supposedly impregnable defenses, and the psychological impact was immense. British and Indian morale soared, because someone had finally taken the fight to the enemy, while Japanese commanders had to divert troops and resources to guard their rear areas, living in constant fear of another Chindit strike. And Winston Churchill, understanding the propaganda value, even if the military value was questionable, declared the operation a success and ordered it expanded, which led to the second and much larger Chindit operation in 1944, this time with 20,000 men organized into 6 brigades. And this operation was even more audacious, because Wingate convinced the Americans to provide him with gliders and transport aircraft, allowing him to fly entire brigades directly into the heart of Japanese territory. And on the night of March 5, 1944, one of the most ambitious airborne operations of World War II began, as dozens of gliders carrying Chindit soldiers, mules, artillery, and engineering equipment took off from airfields in India and flew hundreds of miles into Burma, aiming for jungle clearings deep behind Japanese lines. And the first wave was a catastrophe, because the clearings were smaller than anticipated. Gliders crashed into trees, men and animals were killed in the wreckage, equipment was destroyed. But Wingate's planners adapted quickly, marking obstacles, improving landing zones, and subsequent waves landed more successfully. Within days, the Chindits had established fortified bases behind Japanese lines, equipped with airstrips for resupply. And from these strongholds, they launched raids throughout northern Burma. They attacked the Chindit bases with everything they had: infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, even suicide charges, and the fighting was brutal. Close-quarters jungle combat, where visibility was measured in yards, and battles were decided by bayonets and grenades. But the Chindits held, supplied entirely by air, evacuating their wounded by light aircraft from jungle airstrips, bringing in reinforcements the same way, proving that a modern army could sustain complex operations without conventional supply lines. Except there was a problem. The operations architect would never see its conclusion, because on March 24, 1944, just weeks into the operation, Ord Wingate died when his aircraft crashed in the jungle during a storm, and with him died much of the strategic vision for the Chindits. Because Wingate's replacement commanders didn't fully understand his tactics, didn't share his almost mystical belief in the power of irregular warfare, and they began using the Chindits in more conventional roles, having them hold positions instead of raiding and withdrawing, turning them into static defenders rather than mobile guerrillas, which played to Japanese strengths rather than Chindit advantages. And the casualties mounted horrifically. Men who had survived months of jungle warfare were now dying in frontal assaults and defensive battles. And by the time the operation ended in August 1944, the Chindits had suffered over 5,000 casualties. And once again the question arose, was it worth it? Because measured purely by territorial gains or enemy killed, the Chindits' contribution was arguably disproportionate to their losses. They hadn't captured any major objectives, hadn't destroyed any Japanese armies, had spent enormous resources for what seemed like limited results. And after the war, many military historians condemned the Chindit operations as costly sideshows that had absorbed men and material that could have been better used elsewhere. But this analysis misses something crucial, because the Chindits weren't really about conventional military objectives. They were about breaking paradigms, about proving that the rules everyone thought were unbreakable could actually be shattered. Before the Chindits, it was accepted wisdom that you couldn't operate without supply lines, that jungle warfare favored the Japanese, that European soldiers couldn't match Asian troops in that environment, and Wingate proved all of that wrong. He showed that air supply could replace ground logistics, that aggressive tactics could overcome environmental challenges, that psychological impact mattered as much as body counts, and the influence of Chindit tactics extended far beyond Burma, because American forces watched the Chindits and created Merrill's Marauders using similar principles. And after the war, Chindit veterans helped develop the tactics and doctrine that would be used by special forces worldwide. The SAS, the Green Berets, modern irregular warfare theory, all of it traces lineage back to those ragged columns stumbling through the Burmese jungle. But the cost, oh, the cost was terrible, because the Chindit casualty rate wasn't just from combat. disease killed more men than Japanese bullets. Malaria, typhus, dysentery, infections from jungle sores, mental breakdowns from the stress of constant danger and isolation. And even those who survived often carried the scars forever. There were accounts of Chindit veterans who never recovered psychologically, who would wake screaming from nightmares of the jungle decades after the war ended, who couldn't adjust to normal life after experiencing that level of hardship and violence. And this raises uncomfortable questions about Wingate's leadership. Because was he a visionary, or was he reckless? Did he push his men to achieve the impossible, or did he waste their lives for his own glory? And the answer is probably both. Because Wingate was genuinely brilliant in his tactical innovations. His understanding of irregular warfare was decades ahead of his time. His ability to inspire men to attempt the seemingly impossible was extraordinary. But he was also harsh, unforgiving, willing to sacrifice his soldiers in ways that troubled even hardened commanders. He once ordered sick and wounded men abandoned in the jungle because they slowed the column. He pushed exhausted soldiers beyond human endurance, and he showed little apparent empathy for the suffering he demanded. And this is where Wingate's character becomes truly complicated, because by all accounts he was deeply religious, constantly quoting the Old Testament, seeing himself as an instrument of divine purpose. Yet he could be cold and calculating in his treatment of the men. Under his command, he lived as ascetically as his soldiers, sharing their hardships, eating the same rations, marching the same distances, which earned him respect. But he also enforced discipline with an iron hand. And there are accounts of him publicly humiliating officers he felt weren't meeting his standards, of him relieving commanders on the spot for showing weakness. And some who served under him described him with something approaching fear rather than affection. Yet others idolized him, saw him as the only commander willing to actually fight the Japanese on equal terms. And this contradiction defined the man. He was simultaneously inspiring and terrifying, visionary and potentially unhinged. And his death in that plane crash has led to endless speculation about what he might have achieved had he lived. Would he have adapted his tactics as the war progressed? Or would his rigidity have led to even greater disasters? Would he have become a celebrated hero? Or a cautionary tale about the dangers of unconventional thinking? And we'll never know, because he died at the height of his influence, his methods still being tested, his legacy still unwritten. But what we do know is that the Chindit operations revealed something fundamental about military innovation, which is that breakthrough tactics almost always come from outsiders, from people who don't respect the conventional wisdom, because they don't fully understand it or don't care about it. And Wingate was the ultimate outsider. He had spent years in Palestine before the war, developing counterinsurgency tactics, fighting Arab rebels. Tactics that outraged the British establishment. They were too aggressive, too unconventional, too willing to blur the lines of acceptable military conduct. He had been recalled in disgrace, had attempted suicide, had been written off as unstable and unreliable. And yet when Britain was desperate in Burma, when conventional approaches had failed catastrophically, suddenly, Wingate's crazy ideas didn't seem so crazy anymore. Suddenly, his willingness to break every rule looked like exactly what was needed. And this pattern repeats throughout military history. It's always the mavericks and the madmen who pioneer new ways of fighting. Because people who respect the system don't challenge it. They work within it, optimize it, perfect it, but they don't revolutionize it. And Wingate didn't just disrespect the system, he seemed to actively despise it. He thought military bureaucracy was cowardly, thought conventional commanders were too risk-averse, thought the whole establishment had become soft and needed to be shocked into effectiveness. And the Chindits were his shock therapy. His way of proving that soldiers could do far more than anyone thought possible, if you just stopped coddling them and started demanding the impossible. But here's where the ethics get murky. Because yes, the Chindits proved that conventional supply lines weren't necessary, that jungle warfare could be mastered, that aggressive tactics could overcome numerical disadvantages. But was proving those points worth thousands of casualties? Was innovation worth that price in human suffering? And there's no easy answer, because warfare itself is a moral catastrophe. Every military operation involves sending people to die for strategic objectives. The question is always whether the objectives justify the deaths, and with the Chindits, the strategic value was genuinely questionable. They disrupted Japanese logistics. They tied down enemy forces. They provided a psychological boost to Allied morale. But did they shorten the war? Did they save more lives than they cost? And honest military historians admit we don't really know. Because causation in warfare is impossibly complex. You can't run controlled experiments. You can't know what would have happened if those same resources had been used differently. All you can do is make judgment calls based on incomplete information, which is exactly what Churchill did when he supported Wingate. He decided that the potential benefits, both military and psychological, outweighed the certain costs. And maybe he was right. Was seduced by Wingate's charisma, and convinced by his own need for good news from a theater of war that had seen nothing but disasters. Because let's be honest about the context here. When Wingate proposed his first Chindit operation, Britain had just suffered humiliating defeats across Asia. Singapore had fallen. Burma had been lost. British prestige in the region was shattered. There was genuine fear that India might be next. And British and Indian troops were demoralized, convinced that Japanese soldiers were somehow superior jungle fighters who couldn't be beaten on their own terrain. So Churchill needed a success, needed proof that British forces could fight back. And Wingate offered him that proof, whether it was strategically optimal or not. And you can see this same dynamic play out in other wars. Commanders under pressure to show results, to demonstrate progress, to justify continued investment in a campaign. And they turn to unconventional operators, promising quick, dramatic victories. And sometimes these gambles pay off spectacularly, but other times they lead to disasters. And the line between visionary success and catastrophic failure is often razor-thin, determined more by luck than planning. And Wingate walked that line constantly. His first expedition came very close to complete annihilation. If Japanese forces had been slightly more effective, if the weather had been slightly worse, if air support had failed at a critical moment, the entire force could have been wiped out. And then Wingate would be remembered not as a pioneer, but as a reckless fool, who wasted 3,000 lives. But because enough men survived, because the propaganda value was significant, the operation got reframed as a success. And this reframing reveals something about how we construct military history, because we tend to judge operations by their outcomes, rather than their decision-making process. We celebrate commanders whose risks paid off, and condemn those whose risks failed, even if the quality of their thinking was identical. It's results-oriented evaluation taken to an extreme. And it means that luck plays a huge role in military reputation. Wingate is considered a genius, partly because his plane crashed before his second operation could fully play out, freezing his reputation at a moment of hope rather than potential disillusionment. If he had lived and the operation had clearly failed, his legacy would be completely different. But death gave him mythic status. The brilliant innovator cut down before his full potential could be realized. And this myth has been incredibly powerful, influencing generations of military thinkers, inspiring countless special operations units. But myths are dangerous because they simplify. They turn complex, ambiguous reality into clear narratives. And the clear narrative of Wingate is that boldness and innovation can overcome any obstacle. That conventional military wisdom is for cowards and bureaucrats. That real warriors embrace risk and hardship. And there's truth in that narrative. Militaries do need people willing to challenge assumptions, do need operators who can think creatively under pressure. But the narrative also ignores the failures, the unnecessary casualties, the operations that achieved nothing, and more importantly, it ignores the question of whether the same objectives could have been achieved with less suffering. Because one of the critiques of the Chindits is that their successes came despite Wingate's methods rather than because of them. That with better planning, better logistics, better leadership, they could have achieved more with fewer casualties. And there's evidence for this, because the later stages of the second Chindit operation, after Wingate died and more conventional commanders took over, actually saw some of their most significant successes. They captured the airfield at Myitkyina. They disrupted Japanese operations throughout northern Burma. They achieved concrete objectives rather than just raiding and withdrawing. Now Wingate's defenders would argue that none of that would have been possible without his initial groundwork, without his proof that jungle operations were feasible, and they're probably right. But it's also true that Wingate's methods were evolving, that he was learning from mistakes, that the second operation was more sophisticated than the first, and we can't know how he would have adapted if he had lived, whether he would have become more pragmatic or doubled down on his most extreme ideas. And this uncertainty makes him endlessly fascinating to military historians, because he represents potential, the road not taken, the innovator who died before his theories could be fully tested. And in the decades since World War II, Wingate's influence has been enormous. Every special forces unit in the world has studied the Chindits. The idea of small, highly trained units operating behind enemy lines, sustained by air support, focused on disruption rather than conquest. That's the foundation of modern special operations doctrine. And you can draw a direct line from Wingate's Chindits to the Vietnam-era special forces, to the SAS operations in the Falklands, to the Navy SEALs in Afghanistan. They're all using variations of Wingate's basic concept. But what's interesting is that most modern special forces have learned from Wingate's mistakes as much as his successes. They use smaller units, they prioritize intelligence and planning over audacity, they have much more robust extraction and medical support. Because modern special forces doctrine has incorporated Wingate's innovative spirit while rejecting his seeming indifference to casualties. They've kept the creativity while adding the care, which is arguably what Wingate would have wanted, because for all his flaws, he genuinely believed he was serving his soldiers by demanding the best from them. He thought that treating them as capable of extraordinary things was a form of respect, that lowering standards or reducing risks was actually insulting their abilities. And there's a philosophical argument there, about whether it's better to protect people from hardship or to trust them to rise to challenges, about whether casualty aversion makes armies more humane or just less effective. And different militaries have answered this question differently. Some prioritize force protection above all else, using technology and overwhelming firepower to minimize their own casualties, while others accept higher risks in pursuit of mission accomplishment. And neither approach is clearly superior. It depends on context, on objectives, on political constraints. But what Wingate forces us to confront is the cost of innovation, because breakthrough tactics are almost by definition risky. They haven't been tested, they might fail catastrophically, and someone has to be willing to take that risk. And usually the people taking the risks aren't the ones making the decisions, which is the eternal moral hazard of military command. Generals order soldiers to attempt dangerous operations, and if it works, the generals get the credit. If it fails, the soldiers pay the price. And Wingate complicated this dynamic because he genuinely shared the risks. He went on the first Chindit expedition himself, marched alongside his men, lost weight, and suffered from disease just like they did. So he wasn't an armchair theorist sending others into danger. He was a practitioner who lived his theories, and that earned him credibility. But it doesn't necessarily make his decisions right, because good intentions don't justify bad outcomes. And the question remains whether the Chindit operations were worth the cost. And I've been circling this question for a while now, Because there's no satisfying answer. Because the truth is that military history is full of operations that were simultaneously wasteful and necessary, stupid and brilliant, criminal and heroic. And the Chindits were all of these things. They were poorly planned and brilliantly executed, and saved the Allied position in Burma. They proved new concepts and ignored obvious problems. And Wingate himself embodied these contradictions. He was mad and sane, cruel and inspirational, reckless and calculating. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Chindits. That breakthrough innovation requires people who are willing to be wrong, who are willing to sacrifice, who are willing to push beyond what's comfortable or reasonable. Because comfortable and reasonable approaches produce incremental improvements. They don't produce revolutions. And sometimes militaries need revolutions. Need someone to come along and say, everything we're doing is wrong, and here's a completely different approach, even if that approach is flawed, even if it costs lives. Because the alternative might be continuing to do things that don't work, continuing to lose battles, continuing to see no path to victory. And in that context, Wingate's madness starts to look more like courage. His willingness to break rules looks more like necessary iconoclasm. And his casualties, while tragic, might have been inevitable, given the circumstances, because Britain was fighting a desperate war in Burma. Conventional approaches had failed. Something had to change. And Wingate changed it, for better or worse. And we're still arguing about which. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the best military innovations should be controversial, should make us uncomfortable, should force us to grapple with hard questions about means and ends. And if we ever reach a point where military innovation is uncontroversial, where new tactics are universally praised, that probably means we've stopped taking real risks, stopped pushing real boundaries, stopped having people like Wingate who are willing to attempt the impossible. And maybe we need the Wingates of the world, need the madmen and mavericks, need people who don't know or don't care that something is impossible. Because sometimes that ignorance or that audacity is exactly what breaks through. And Wingate himself embodied these contradictions. He was mad and sane, cruel and inspirational, reckless and calculating. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Chindits. That breakthrough innovation requires people who are willing to be wrong, who are willing to sacrifice, who are willing to push beyond what's comfortable or reasonable. Because comfortable and reasonable approaches produce incremental improvements. They don't produce revolutions. And sometimes militaries need revolutions. Need someone to come along and say, everything we're doing is wrong, and here's a completely different approach, even if that approach is flawed, even if it costs lives. Because the alternative might be continuing to do things that don't work, continuing to lose battles, continuing to see no path to victory. And in that context, Wingate's madness starts to look more like courage. His willingness to break rules looks more like necessary iconoclasm. And his casualties, while tragic, might have been inevitable, given the circumstances, because Britain was fighting a desperate war in Burma. Conventional approaches had failed. Something had to change. And Wingate changed it, for better or worse. And we're still arguing about which. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the best military innovations should be controversial, should make us uncomfortable, should force us to grapple with hard questions about means and ends. And if we ever reach a point where military innovation is uncontroversial, where new tactics are universally praised, that probably means we've stopped taking real risks, stopped pushing real boundaries, stopped having people like Wingate who are willing to attempt the impossible. And maybe we need the Wingates of the world, need the madmen and mavericks, need people who don't know or don't care that something is impossible. Because sometimes that ignorance or that audacity is exactly what breaks through. And the Chindits broke through. They proved that British forces could fight in the jungle, could take the war to the Japanese, could survive and operate in conditions everyone said were impossible. And yes, it cost thousands of casualties. Yes, many of those casualties were preventable. Yes, Wingate's methods were brutal and his planning was often inadequate. But the fundamental strategic insight was sound. Air power could substitute for ground logistics. Mobility could overcome numerical disadvantages. Psychological warfare mattered. And these insights shaped the rest of the Burma campaign, shaped Allied strategy in the Pacific, shaped post-war military doctrine. So in that sense, the Chindits were absolutely worth it. They changed how wars were fought, and that's worth remembering, worth studying, worth grappling with, because military history isn't just about who won and who lost. It's about how we think about war, how we balance innovation and caution, how we decide what risks are acceptable, and the Chindits force us to confront these questions in their most extreme form, because they were the ultimate high-risk, high-reward operation. They broke every rule and paid a terrible price and achieved something genuinely significant, and we're still trying to figure out what to make of that, still arguing about Wingate's legacy, still debating whether he was a genius or a madman. And the answer is probably that he was both. And that's what made him dangerous and necessary, and tragic and inspiring. And that's why 70 years later we're still talking about his ragged columns marching through the Burmese jungle, still trying to extract lessons from their suffering and their success, still grappling with the war plan that broke every military rule and somehow, impossibly, worked.